The day began, like hundreds of others, in silence, filled with the ringing of an old desk alarm clock. Kate stood by the window and looked out at the empty street. The clock was 7 in the morning, and there was no one on the sidewalk. Only the dark clouds hanging over the gray city indicated a change of weather. Robert had long since left for work, and the house was, as usual, filled with emptiness. After swallowing coffee, which tasted no better than the day itself, Kate put on her coat, took her umbrella, and left the house. There was no particular purpose except to go into the city center, spend a few hours in the store or the cafe, swallow a little bit of the hustle and bustle of others, to somehow drown out the loneliness that had long since become familiar. On the way to the bus stop, the sky was covered with dark, almost ink clouds, and soon the first raindrops fell on the ground. Before she could open the umbrella, she was covered from head to toe in the water, and she ran down the street, and she ran into the first cafe she could find, and the door slammed shut, and she looked back, and it was a dim atmosphere inside, little tables, a bar, a little bit of dirt. She looked at her from behind the bar, as if seeing her wed in this deserted place was a real event, and she sat down at the window table and ordered a hot latte, hoping that the rain would soon stop, and the sound of drops beating on the glass made her feel more isolated. And then he came in tall, with a slight brush, and his hair carefully strung. He took off his hood, and he looked around for a moment, as if to see who could ask for a seat, and suddenly his eyes stopped on Kate. A second later, and he turned to her, smiling slightly. "Orania?" he started, not even saying hello, and he smiled wider. It wasn't every day that a stranger would come up to her and sit across the table without asking, but there was something alive and careless about it, like him. "It seems like it's a mistake to go out of the house today," Kate replied, smiling too. "And you seem to have gotten wet through it." "Kate," she shook his hand, wondering at the inner calm. In fact, no one had called her beautiful or interesting for a long time, and Robert had stopped looking at her, as if she could surprise. And now the stranger was relieved, as if she didn't need to play any roles with him. And Kate could feel her tension slowly fading, and the rain kept on knocking on the glass, silencing her voices, and she, as if losing track of time, succumbed to his conversation. "Max told me about this cafe, which he said was a real meeting place, and he even added that one day he happened to meet a friend here that he hadn't seen since university. It's like half the people here just come to sit through the rain," he said, and there was a spark in his eyes. The conversation went smoothly, as if they'd known each other for years. Kate suddenly caught herself telling Max about her house in the suburbs, about how she felt cut off from ordinary life. She spoke about it as easily as if she was opening up to an old friend. Max listened attentively, sometimes nodding, occasionally asking questions. His interest was sincere, and it disarmed her. "Sometimes it seems like you live in your little box and life is passing by," she said, wondering to herself. "A familiar feeling," he replied, looking her straight in the eye. "I must be hiding in my little box too. It's safe, right?" That phrase sounded so simple, but with the understanding that Kate had, she thought, he really knows what he's talking about. He wasn't just listening, he understood. She didn't know why it was so important to her, but she wanted to see him again. An hour passed, another one followed, and Max seemed to be in no hurry to leave either. They sat next to each other, and it was as if they both knew that when they went outside, the moment of their meeting would fade away like a thought. But neither she nor he was in a hurry to leave the little cafe. His eyes were confident and light-hearted, and in her heart there was an unusual sense of freedom. When the rain began to subside, Max finally got up, slowly putting on his jacket. Kate also put on her coat, preparing to leave the cozy shelter. He gave her a goodbye look, and she suddenly smiled for herself, catching his gaze. "I'd be glad to see you here again," he said with a slight smile, as if to challenge her. She wanted to say something in reply, but suddenly she got stuck, and he had already gone out, leaving her alone. She stood for a few more seconds, watching his figure dissolve under the last raindrops. On her way home, Kate thought about him. She didn't know why she needed to see Max again, and she wasn't even sure she wanted to see him again. But something about it was exciting and exciting. How long had she not felt something like this? For the first time in years, Kate realized that she was smiling for no reason. And the strangest thing was that she didn't care if Robert noticed her mood, because it was hers alone. The next morning, Kate couldn't even get out of the house for a long time. The weather was clear, no shadow of the rain yesterday, but her heart was breaking back into that same cafe. She convinced herself that it was just an innocent desire to see him again, and maybe have a little chat over coffee. It didn't mean anything. At least she repeated it when she took her coat from the hanger, put it on, and went out the door. The bus took her to the center of town, where the usual noise and rush of the stream surrounded her as she slowly walked to the cafe. With each step, Kate became more and more aware of the strange sharpness of her desire. She not only wanted to see Max again, but also to feel the ease with which he allowed her to be herself. She felt like for the first time in years she was being heard and understood. When she opened the door of the cafe, her heart sank. She glanced inside. Max was gone. She felt a strange frustration, but she forced herself to get a coffee and take the same table by the window. As she drank the hot drink, the cafe slowly filled with people, and more her eyes were turned to the door. It was silly. She knew it, but she kept waiting, unable to leave. Half an hour passed, and Kate was about to leave when he appeared at the door. Max walked in, looked around the room, saw her, and smiled as if he was expecting to see her. "Kate, you're back," he said, stepping over to her table. "I'm beginning to suspect that the rain has brought us to the right place. I was just thinking, is this just a chance visit, or are we hiding from the sun?" Max smiled, comfortably sitting across the hall. "Let the sun shine," he said. "I've been looking for an excuse to leave the office lately, so the cafe is a great place to wait. Although, to be honest, I was hoping to see you again." Her heart stopped for a moment. Max kept his eyes on her, and there was more to that look than just curiosity. She felt a slight confusion, but quickly took it in her hands, hiding her smile behind a cup of coffee. "Well, then, we really were brought here by the rain," she replied with a playful note in her voice. Maybe it was a sign? Instead of answering, Max just nodded, and she was surprised that he seemed to understand her halfway. The silence was warm and understandable, as if they were discussing something that was taken for granted, something she hadn't felt for a long time. And it was a little intimidating, as if the conversation was as easy as it had been before, touching on different topics, but always returning to something personal hidden. Max told of his small-town childhood, of his parents being too busy to pay attention to him, and Kate learned that he had a brother with whom they had long lost touch, and that he had been living alone. "I'm used to it, but I admit, sometimes I want to open up to someone," and Kate nodded, and her eyes caught on his hand, which was on the table, and she noticed some tiny scars on his fingers, and she suddenly wanted to touch them, as if they might be telling her something else about him. But instead she just said quietly, "Do you know what it is to open up?" "It seems like you do," he replied, raising his eyebrows as if to imply that she was opening up now. Her marriage became a kind of obligation, a familiar ritual with no room for spontaneity or passion, and sitting across from Max, she felt alive, and it just kept growing, and they would meet a few more times in the same cafe, and they would share stories and even jokes about how they were similar. Sometimes Kate would share events she hadn't told anyone for a long time. How she had left her first job, what she had to deal with while Robert was busy with his business, and how one day, out of a sense of sincerity, she even tried to convince him to go on a trip, but she couldn't. He always listened to her, his eyes stayed focused and warm, and then, on their fifth date, Kate couldn't stand it, and yet she allowed herself to ask the question that had been on her tongue for so long. She tried to say it calmly, even though there was a sea of contradictions raging inside. He thought for a moment, as if weighing the answer, and finally quietly said, "Maybe it's because you, Kate, are the same way. Because sometimes you just need to talk. See someone who understands you." She caught his gaze, and in his eyes, she saw something more than just friendliness. It was a hint of something that he might not have dared to put into words yet, but that she felt through her skin. She knew that at that moment they were both on the verge of something inevitable and dangerous. That night, coming home, Kate felt like she had never felt before, on the verge of something important. The house was lit, and Robert had already returned from work, as usual, stuck in his papers. She came in, and there was still a smile on her face after they met. But her joy turned to anxiety when she noticed Robert was looking at her with little apprehension. "You've been late today," he noticed, looking up at her. "Are you all right?" Kate tried to look relaxed, like she had nothing to hide. "All right, I just wanted to walk, to get away." "It was a long day," she replied, trying to speak easily, though she knew he must have noticed her frequent trips into town. He muttered something in reply, and apparently his suspicions were over, but for Kate it was an alarm bell. She felt like she was on the edge, and that every day her encounters with Max were becoming more dangerous, filling her life with new emotions and new fears, and she was lying in bed listening to Robert's breathing, and she was thinking back to the conversation with Max, and there was something in his words that made her heart beat faster, and despite all the anxiety, she wanted to do it again and again. Maybe Max really just wanted to be heard, but she knew there was more to it. And then, in the middle of the night, when everything was dark, Kate suddenly realized that their next meeting could change everything. Every time she gathered in the center, she became more and more aware that meeting Max had become something not only long-awaited, but necessary for her. These walks and conversations filled the void that she could no longer ignore. This time when they met in the cafe, Max suggested that we go outside. The rain had long passed, and the warm, still moist air was filled with the scent of leaves and asphalt. They were walking slowly along the waterfront, and Kate caught herself feeling that their walks were more than just a friendly encounter. Max was walking by, occasionally giving her a thoughtful, slightly sneaky look that made her run on her back, as if he had never been touched by the noise or the hustle and bustle. Kate smiled, and Max suddenly noticed that her face was lit up in a special light that was not typical of their usual meetings. There was something in that expression that gave him the courage to step forward. They stopped, and he looked at her as if he was going to say something important, but didn't decide. "Did something happen? Did you ever think about what makes us happy?" Max suddenly said it, as if he was saying something simple and obvious. Kate felt her heart beat faster. She could have said that happiness for her is a feeling of understanding and acceptance, but instead she just nodded, realizing that her answer was in the air between them. She didn't have to say a word. It was like a momentary gesture, but the touch was enough to ignite a spark between them. And Kate didn't take her hand off, and she closed her eyes, feeling his touch revive something in her that had been forgotten for a long time, something that she thought was lost forever, and she wanted that moment to last forever. The world around her disappeared, and it was just the two of them, on this damp, almost empty waterfront, hidden from everyone in the shadows of the evening city. Max looked at her with such tenderness and understanding that she felt all the barriers inside her falling down. She finally allowed herself to admit that she could no longer pretend that it didn't matter. Every moment she spent with him seemed the most real. "Kate," he said softly, and in his voice there was some silent request. She didn't know what to say. Kate stood there, feeling his hand touch her own, and at that moment she realized that her life could not be the same. But she was enveloped in fear and uncertainty. When she thought of Robert, she felt a burden of guilt and doubt. She stepped back and let go of his hand, trying to come to her senses. "Max," she whispered, not knowing what to say. "It's wrong. Maybe it's wrong," he answered, not taking her eyes off her. "But don't you feel that it's inevitable?" His words echoed in her mind with a heavy echo. She knew that their meeting would change a lot, but she couldn't see where it would lead her that night. When she came home, she stood in the dark for a long time, looking at her reflection in the mirror, and there was chaos in her head, and every look at Robert only increased that inner confusion. She felt that she had gone too far, and that everything now depended on her next step. Max had awakened something new and forbidden in her, and she wasn't sure if she'd ever be able to go back to her old life. The week passed, and the warm evenings with Max, their conversations and walks became not just a respite for Kate, but something bigger, something that pushed her old life to the back burner. Every time she saw him, she felt a new sense of purpose, and this world, hidden from all, became a refuge for her. But with that feeling, she felt more and more anxious, and she knew that Robert had noticed a change. And lately, he's been looking for an excuse to ask her the questions that were piling up in his head. And one night, when Kate came home later than usual, she immediately felt a strange tension in the air. He put down the phone, put his hands on his chest, and stared at her as if he were waiting for an explanation. It was late again, he noticed, not hiding his displeasure. "Were you with your friends again? Or with your work?" Kate felt her heart beat faster. She knew that lying to him would only make it harder, but she couldn't tell the truth. "Yes, I was in town," she said, trying to keep her cool. "I just needed to get distracted." Her voice was surprisingly confident, even though everything was buzzing inside. "It's strange how you want to get distracted," he continued, a little bit stunned. "You drive downtown almost every day. Isn't that too much, do you think?" Kate felt her throat crushed. Robert was rarely so suspicious and picky. Maybe she underestimated his observation. Or, rather, her actions finally became obvious. "Robert, are you really going to discuss this?" she asked, trying to get the situation under control. "Isn't it my right to do my own thing?" "Of course, it's your right," he replied sharply. "But something I can't remember is the last time you were away from home that long. You always had a certain routine, and now something has changed." Robert paused, and Kate felt his gaze studying her, trying to penetrate her mask. She tried to smile, hoping it would distract him. "Robert, I'm just a little bit more into other things, and if it bothers you—" "It bothers you," he interrupted her with a non-excusable expression. "So please tell me what's really going on." You know, Robert knew that it wasn't just random walks. Maybe he didn't know about Max yet, but his intuition was already signaling something important. Kate knew that it didn't make sense to back off, but admitting it would be tantamount to destroying everything to the core. "We haven't really spoken in a long time," she started, but he just sighed, not letting her talk. "But apparently you have other priorities now." And Kate felt a wave of anger rising inside her, but at the same time, it hurt, and Robert's words cut her, causing her to feel a painful sense of guilt, and she suddenly saw their relationship from the outside, routine, cold, as if they were apart. And for the first time in a long time, she felt sorry for not only herself, but for him. "Robert, I'm really sorry," she said, lowering her eyes. "Maybe I'm too involved in but believe me, that doesn't mean I don't appreciate what we have." Her words sounded too unconvincing. Robert kept looking at her, and his eyes reflected resentment and anger. He got up, walked around the room, and looked at the table as if he was going to say something else, but from the look on his face, he held back. "Okay, Kate, I'll leave it at that," he finally said, turning his back to her. "But believe me, I'm not blind. And if you really think that everything is okay, then maybe you just forgot what our life is like." He left the room, leaving her standing in silence. Her soul was filled with a sense of loss and longing. Robert didn't say much, but his words suggested that he would not settle down and seek answers. She knew that they were on the verge of death, and that any further move could be fatal. Later that night, Kate was sleepless for a long time, knowing that their secret meetings with Max would be revealed anyway. Robert was not a man who would simply forget suspicions, and she knew that he could find out the truth at any moment. The next day, Kate woke up with a faint sense of anxiety that was firmly entrenched inside her. A small kitchen lamp lit the room with a soft light, but the morning calm no longer brought her the comfort she had been accustomed to. Robert was sitting at the table, staring at the phone screen as if he hadn't noticed her presence. And perhaps it was worse than the suspicious look. Kate pretended to be fine, but she felt her heart begin to beat furiously. Their last quarrel hurt her more deeply than she could admit to herself. She tried not to look at Robert, not to notice his silent displeasure and barely noticeable coldness. Kate was finishing her breakfast, trying to relieve the tension, when Robert suddenly broke the silence. "Are you in town again today?" He threw it, without even looking up. The question sounded straightforward, without a shadow of interest, but Kate felt a sting. She realized that Robert was no longer trying to hide the suspicion and irritation that had been building up over the last few days. "Yes," she answered, trying to give a voice of confidence. "I'm meeting a friend." Her answer sounded too fast, too repetitive. She knew Robert would notice, but she kept on sticking to her position, because she had no choice. Robert didn't react, but his silence seemed much louder than any words. The day seemed heavy and tense. Kate met Max in their favorite cafe, and despite her best efforts, she couldn't hide her anxiety. Max, noticing her distraction, immediately tried to find out what had happened. "Is there a problem with Robert?" Kate nodded as she looked into the cup of coffee, as if he could tell her what to do next. She knew that every time they dated was a step towards a chasm from which there was no way out. But as she looked at Max, she realized that she could no longer just drop everything. She became more open than usual. "You began to suspect," she said, without taking her eyes off the cup. "He doesn't say it directly, but I can see it in his eyes. He understands everything." Max shrugged her hand, not wanting to let go, and his gesture spoke more than any words. He was hard to see her suffering, but he was well aware that sooner or later this moment would come. Maybe he was even waiting for him, realizing that they had no future until she made a choice. "Listen, why don't we stop hiding?" he offered quietly, as if reading her mind. "Kate, I can't be a secret to you anymore. Maybe it's time." His words, so quiet and so decisive, suddenly came down on her with all their weight. She looked away, feeling cornered, unable to find an answer, and Max sighed, let go of her hand, and kept quiet, as if given her time to digest his words. But inside Kate was growing a sense of panic. Perhaps it wasn't so much the fear of losing Max as the realization that her life was crumbling right in front of her. She nodded, not wanting to make any promises, but she knew she had to make a decision, no matter how painful it was. When she got home later than usual, Kate found Robert in the hallway. He was leaning against the wall, his hands on his chest, and his face was impenetrable. His eyes were staring, studying, as if he was waiting for something. "Where were you?" he asked coldly, not moving from his place. She was about to answer, but he immediately raised his hand, indicating that he was ready to hear only the truth. "Kate, I know everything," he said in a flat voice, and there was no reproach or threat in his tone. Only a cold calm. "I saw you with him. I wanted to tell you about this for a long time, but I waited. Waited for you to confess." Her breath caught. Robert really knew. He knew, and she couldn't hide or lie anymore. Kate could feel her face fill with pain. It was shame, it was something close to panic. But there was her husband, and he deserved an answer. "Kate, I don't think there's anything to explain. You betrayed me. You did it behind my back while I believed we were okay. And now you can't explain it?" Kate lowered her head, couldn't stand the sight of him. She made a step towards him, but Robert stepped back, as if his touch was now disgusting. "I didn't want to believe it," he continued, and his voice sounded as if it were from far away. "I tried not to notice your departures, your endless meetings. I thought maybe it was all in my head, maybe it was my own fears. But I was wrong." He turned away from her again, and this time there was something in his gaze that made her heart ache. He was full of disappointment, but more than anything he was full of hurt. "Why?" he asked, looking at her, and that was probably the most terrifying question. Kate didn't know what to say. She knew she loved Max, but she knew that her feelings for Robert were real. He was everything to her for many years, and she couldn't just leave him. But standing in front of him, she felt that their relationship would never be the same again. Sorry, she finally spoke, realizing all the helplessness of those words. Sorry, Robert, I was confused. He shook his head as if he didn't believe it, and taking a deep breath, he went into the bedroom without saying another word. She was standing in the empty hallway, not knowing what to do, feeling her world crumble right in front of her. The evening was spent in tense silence. Kate was standing in the empty living room, feeling her world shatter in seams. Robert's words echoed in her head. You betrayed me. They were so simple, but so painful, that she couldn't believe he had said them. Robert locked himself in his bedroom, and his silence seemed to divide them into two worlds. She knew that even if he wanted to forgive her, their relationship would never be the same. And even though Kate knew she was to blame, a part of her persisted in drawing to Max. She felt alive, real, but now, standing alone in a cold, empty house, she suddenly realized that this choice between two lives was a burden she could not bear. The next day, Kate decided to meet Max to talk. She came to their usual cafe, where he was already waiting for her, noticing her from the doorstep. His smile was almost extinguished when he saw her face. She looked tired, lost, and he seemed to know what had happened immediately. Robert knew, she said quietly, without waiting for a greeting. Max frowned, and there was so much compassion in his eyes that she felt even more vulnerable. He took her hand, squeezed her fingers, tried to support, but Kate felt like she needed to say more, that she needed to put all the dots on the top. Max, I don't know if I can. Her voice trembled, and she sighed, picking words. I don't know if I can leave my family. Robert. He's certainly not perfect, but he's been a friend and a support for me for years. I'm not sure I'm ready to break everything we've had. He listened quietly, without interrupting her, though there was a hint of disappointment in his eyes. Max knew she couldn't just walk away from Robert, and deep down he'd known that for a long time. But it was hard to hear it out loud. I just want you to be happy, even if it's not me. Kate looked at him, not believing he could say that. There was so much self-denial and strength in his words that she was overwhelmed. She knew that Max felt something more for her than a fleeting crush, but his willingness to leave for her peace only compounded the pain. She realized she couldn't make a choice. She couldn't frame Robert or Max without destroying herself. Thank you, Max, she said, feeling a lonely tear rolling down her cheek. Thank you for being there for me, for listening to me when I didn't understand myself. He nodded, not answering, and her heart was broken when she realized that this might be their last meeting. She had to step back to figure out what she really wanted, and she said goodbye to Max, and their hands were untied, like they were finally breaking the bond that had bound them for so long. His face was tired, and there was a certain unshakable determination in his eyes that confused her. We need to talk, he began, and there was no shadow of the bitterness in his voice. I thought a lot about us, about what happened between us, and I realized that maybe we both got separated. You may have found someone who gave you what I couldn't give you, but I'm not the person I used to be either, and we both need to figure out what we want out of this life. And maybe that means we need to be apart. And those words pierced her like a knife, and she felt like it wasn't just a breakup, but a conscious, serious choice between two people who were once so close. But she knew that Robert was right. Their relationship was on the verge, and they both needed time to figure out if they could ever get back together. You're right, she said, trying to speak calmly, even though she was shaking inside. I think we both needed time and space to figure ourselves out. And maybe this would be a chance to start over, who knows? He just nodded, and there was understanding in his eyes. They sat in silence for a long time, and the silence was like their previous lives, full of meaning but empty. The next day, Robert packed up and left, leaving her alone in the house where she once felt safe. Her heart was filled with mixed feelings, partly relief, partly sadness, and sometimes joy at the freedom she had found. But now she had to find herself, find out who she really was and what she needed. She decided to go on a journey alone, to the small coastal town that she and Robert had once dreamed of. There, on the shore, Kay felt a fresh breeze of change sweeping over her, and she stood there, breathing the sea air, and she realized that for the first time in years, she could truly be herself. She knew that there would be challenges and trials ahead, but she no longer had to hide behind masks or pretend. She was ready for a new beginning, real, honest, and her own.